Hello and welcome to Farmer Safety Corner. Today, October 20th, we had a little bit of a brisk morning this morning, but we've seen the leaves changing over the last few weeks and we knew this was coming, getting ready to fall into winter. But also, October is Emergency Preparedness Month. So we like to focus a little bit on emergency response plans and making sure they're up to date. It's a great month to just set that aside to do a full review of your emergency response plans and check to see the number of first aiders you have available. And especially if you're ending your season now, getting prepared for the next season to make sure everything is in place. So what I'm going to do is run through some of the resources we have available on the Farm Safety Nova Scotia website to help you get your workers trained in first aid. So I'm going to show you how to sign up and how to access that and where that information is. But I'm also going to show you how to access some templates for building emergency response plans, whether you need a remote first aid plan, and going through some of those particular details. So first, if you're ever looking for anything on the Farm Safety website, just click that search button at the top, and I'm going to click it here. And then you can just start typing emergency if you like, and then click the search. It usually works. There it goes. I've been having a little bit of slow internet, and I'm not sure if it's because of my battery. I'm having a few laptop issues here, so hopefully this will last until the end of today's session. So first, as mentioned, training. Let's figure out where we find out how to get people trained. So here is where we list the types of courses that are available and that are required under the first aid regulations, depending on the number of people you have. So if we kind of look here, we have a list. So if you have 1 to 19 employees, at least one employee must have emergency first aid training. But if you have 20 to 99, at least one must have standard first aid training. And then, of course, over 100, you need an advanced first aid trainer on site and available at that work site. So this is if you have 1 to 19 for each work site. So it's not for total employees completely employed on the farm. It's for each site. So if you consistently have workers going to field A and there's 3, you need 1 there. Field B, you have say maybe 21 workers, you need a standard first aider there. And then field C, you just have 1 person working. That person needs to have emergency first aid as well. And then just a quick note down here, anyone who is working alone must have standard first aid as well. And this would include your equipment operators and your drivers. So if they're out there working independently on their own, they too require emergency first aid training. So this is the cost of training to hold it on farm. So for emergency first aid in class, this is about 8 hours in length, is $60. But there is the blended learning option, and that's right here. What this means is you would do 4 hours of first aid online and then 4 hours of first aid in class. So the online training covers all of the theory, and the in-class part is all about skills. So it's quite an active component versus doing theory and skills together in the in-class only option. And so as well, we have the same options available for in-class and blended for standard first aid. The in-class only is about 2 days and takes about 14 to 16 hours, depending on the level of CPR that you're going to choose to do. So if you're just going to do level A, adult only, it's going to be about 14 hours of training. But if you choose to do adult, child, and baby, level C CPR, then you're looking at 16 hours worth of training. But you can split that using blended learning, where 8 hours is approximately online and approximately 8 hours of in class being the second day, comprising of your 14 to 16 hours. And so very good resource there. All of our training is workplace compliant and is done through St. John Ambulance. Further to that, I have another little tool. If you're not sure what to do, and you kind of need to use an evaluation chart to help you figure this out. It also goes through not only the first aid training, but also the number of first aid kits as well. So if you click resources, go to build a farm safety plan, scroll to the bottom, go in section 5. Section 5 is all about staying prepared or emergency response. And then workbook. This is where all of our workable templates and evaluation tools, policies are housed. Just click download workbook files. And then down here we have first aid needs evaluation. So I'm going to click on this. It comes up as a Word document, so you can easily download it yourself and manipulate it to your specific farm needs. And when it opens up, it goes through, it's a couple of pages here, but it's full of instruction and give you the rationale behind why certain things are needed. So the key point here, though, is there's a chart to identify each of the locations that you have on your farm, and you can make this adjustment and change these to your own. Put in the number of workers at each of those locations, like we talked about, because you need at least one for every 1 to 19 people, one emergency first aider for 1 to 19 people at every work site. So that was a little bit of a mouthful. So now you can calculate how many of first aiders are needed, and then list here what the level of training is required. And then later on, as you will look down here, we also can consider now the level of first aid kit or a first aid room if needed. So this chart here down below goes through and gives you the details of the information that needs to be plugged into this chart. So you know how many people you're going to need to have trained in either emergency or standard first aid, and which kit that you'll need to have on site. So an easily workable document that you can kind of walk through and then make your calculations, and then of course call Farm Safety Nova Scotia and set up your training. So one thing here too, on the back of this page, we go through the first aider responsibility. So is this criteria being met? We go to the condition of the first aid supplies. Is this criteria being met? Do you have transportation for your injured workers at each of the work sites? So is this criteria being met? And then of course, how many of you know that a first aid record needs to be completed once the first aid kit is open and contents are used? Yes, you have to document that. And that is part of the first aid regulations, which we're going to talk about in a little bit here. So that document needs to be completed to record what the contents were taken, but also record the injury. And this is a private document after it's been completed. So this should be something that is shared only to those who are going to replenish the first aid kit, who's in charge of incident recording. But then that document gets filed into the human resources file for that particular worker. And as mentioned just briefly prior, we will then determine whether you need a first aid plan for remote work areas. So this is the section that kind of outlines that criteria. So if you require a first aid plan, if your work location is more than 30 minutes of surface travel in one direction from an emergency care facility that is open during working hours at a work location. So we then decide, based on these exceptions, if it applies, because this is very general. Okay, so the exceptions are if no employees spend more than 10% of their time measured over a 4-week period at that remote location plan, you don't need one. The second condition is any employee spends more than 10%, but less than 25 of their time measured over a 4-week period at that location. You're not required to have a written first aid remote location plan as long as the following are in place. So you would make sure it meets these conditions as well. So this runs through and highlights occupational health and safety first aid regulations. We can actually hit Control, click, and this will open the web page. And this is on that document in a few places. And so you can compare to the first aid regulations themselves what is required. So always at the top of the regulations is going to be your definitions. And then we start moving into general responsibilities, first aid certificates. This is key, where full-time employees employed in any type of employment that regularly requires the employee to work where there's no one available who could administer first aid or summon assistance within a reasonable length of time, the employee shall hold a valid emergency first aid certificate. So as mentioned before, those are kind of the people that are working independently or alone. And then of course it gives the criteria for the office, each of the work sites, determining the number of employees, vehicles, boats, and aircrafts. Not sure if that's going to apply to you. The maintenance records or the first aid record I just mentioned. Condition of supplies, which is on your checklist. We looked at that. Duties of the first aid attendant, so it lays out the roles and responsibilities. We talked about transportation. And then, of course, goes through powers of the director, so who enforces these regulations. But then we also have the contents of what has to be in a first aid kit. So there's 3 levels of first aid kits that you should have available and as part of your emergency response plans. So the first aid kit is level 1. So this is where there's only one employee regularly employed at a work site. That's where the number 1 kit is required. And these contents must be in the kit to meet and comply with the regulations. But the first aid kit for level 2 is for 20 or more employees at that work site. And then when you scroll down, you'll see level 3 for 20 to 50 employees at that particular work site. But then the first aid room, we know, is for more than 100 people. And then all of these contents as well for the room, and then subsequently for each of the first aid kits. And you should include a first aid kit inspection as part of your worksite inspection process to ensure those kits remain full at all times. And we've reviewed the requirements for the remote locations as part of the first aid evaluation found here. So one fantastic tool that puts all of the requirements of the regulations into 3 pages instead of how many did we scroll through, but in plain language. The only time you would have to go back to the regulation is just to double check your contents of your first aid kit. Keeping in mind, not always the contents on the back of your first aid kit are the same as what's required by regulations. So just making sure you always compare with this list for the work site versus what's on the back of the kit itself. Okay, I'm not going to hop there yet. So we have the first aid record. We have a sample one. So when all the contents or any of the contents are used from the first aid kit, we have to make a note of it, the type of injury, what treatment was provided. And this form 2 is available for you to download and use as your own. So the first aid record is very simple. It's going to detail, of course, the injury at first and what had happened. And then also say the location, the cause, any first aid provided, and the name of that first aider who provided help or care, and then their qualifications. So what level of first aid did they have? And then just describe what was provided, including the contents that were used in the kit. And then, of course, the regulations require us to say if there was a copy provided to the worker, if it was refused, and the worker's initials who were involved in this particular treatment. So 2 great tools there for you to download and use to help in your emergency response plan and preparedness. So first aid record, as well as the first aid needs evaluation. So I think that kind of covers first aid in a nutshell, but what about emergency response plans? We don't have any sample plans here in the guide to the farm safety plan, but we do have some sample plans in our commodity specific farm safety plans that we've built for the fruit growers and for Christmas tree growers. But before I jump there, I just wanted to point out that we have a sample contact information list. So this is a great template to identify all of your emergency phone numbers, your members of your health and safety committee or your health and safety representative, and as well as farm contact information. So if something does happen, all of these numbers are at your fingertips. So I would post these in obvious locations throughout the farm, maybe have your workers put these into their phone and show them how to access them. Keeping in mind, if you have any questions, just put them into the chat feature, but we also have a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen as well. So wherever you prefer to add your questions, feel free just to plug them in there and I will answer them as they pop up. So let's find those commodity specific plans. Under resources, there's our build a farm safety plan, which just gives us that basic template. But here is our commodity specific plans. So we're going to click that. And as mentioned, you can see there's one for fruit growers and one for Christmas tree. So it doesn't matter which one you click, but click one of them. You might want to click both. And then as we remembered from the guide, section 5 was staying prepared. So these sections of the commodity specific plans are set up just like the guide. So when we click section 5, you will see emergency response opens, then the incident reporting and work refusals are below. But here we go. We have emergency response plans here in particular. So if we click on that, it opens up another Word document, which I'm going to open up here. And again, free for you to download and is used and adapt as your own. And what we've done is created in one document a few different emergency response plans. So the first one is for fire, and I'll come back to this in just a second. Establishing a muster point. So how do we figure out where everybody's going to go and meet if there is an emergency? Leaking gases or liquids, natural disasters, spills, and vehicle collision. A couple others that you might want to consider for your specific farm needs, especially if you're working at heights, would be a fall protection plan. And if you're working in confined spaces or at and around near confined spaces, such as manure pits and grain or feed bins, silos, then you would also want to have a confined space rescue plan. So further training for those particular plans are typically required and are available at Safety Services Nova Scotia at a significant discount with our partnership with them. So you can reach out to them specifically, or you can give me a call and we can get you set up for training for those particular hazards, and then you'll be prepared to develop emergency response plans for those two conditions. And so let's just go up to fire. Here we outline the general what to do if you are now notified that there is an emergency. So the biggest thing is do not panic, right? Absolutely. We need to keep calm and be able to work so that we can get everybody evacuated and take action where required. So it goes through step by step what the particular criteria are. So you may need to adapt this. So for instance, sound the alarm to evacuate. If you're working in a very small barn with animals, your alarm, and this is why it's in quotes, may be different. So how do you notify other workers or even your family members, visitors, that there is an emergency? So you should adapt that to your specific procedure that you're going to do and use to notify the group. And then, of course, if you're unable to evacuate in the event of a fire, but down below here, there's also the criteria for emergency equipment that you should have on hand. Now, keeping in mind, this is a guide because depending on the number of people could change the number or the level of the first aid kit that you require. So if it's just one person, it was a level 1 first aid kit. But as you know, level 2 and level 3 had different requirements. So you're going to choose. Also, the fire extinguisher, typically a class ABC, is going to be required. Cell smartphone to be able to call for help. And then that alarm system, as we discussed, which could be anything that you decided, because we don't want to scare animals or do anything along those lines. So we've got to be careful what we choose, especially if we're working in barns and any type of animal facility. So that is where you can get a copy of your emergency response plans. Now, once you've built them, they should be tested. Only makes sense. Does it work? So let's use the evacuation log. And once it downloads here, I'm going to open it up. And again, something for you to download and use as your own. And here, it's a very simple tool. You would put in those who attended the fire drill. So we're just going to keep with that fire scenario at this point. And then you write in the date that you're holding the drill, the start time of the drill, and the end time. So this tells you how long it takes for everyone to get to their safe place or the muster point. So if this is lasting more than 30 minutes, it may be unreasonable, because what can happen in 30 minutes with a fire? What can happen in 2 minutes with a fire? Do I have any of my firefighter guys out there? So especially the volunteers working farm and then helping others in this particular situation. So we should probably make sure this is within a reasonable time frame based on the buildings and personnel that are on your farm. The monitor is just the person who's leading you in this particular activity of fire evacuation. And your evacuation procedure is simply fire and then the location. So you may choose to do this at each of your farm buildings. So maybe we do one from the shed, machine shed. Maybe we do one from the barn. Maybe we do one from the fruit stand or vegetable stand. How long does it take? Where are we going? So you could choose to do it at different locations. Just give a little bit of description of what you did for the drill. So say if it was in the barn, fire broke out next to a heater, which was being used, and caught the straw on fire. So just use a simple description of what you thought could possibly happen, any corrective action that you needed to take. So when you did the drill, what would you change to make it better? That's what the corrective action is. And then when do you plan to follow up? Do you plan to follow up as soon as the plan has been adapted with the new changes, or do you just plan to follow up in the following year? So maybe next October. So that is up to you to decide, but based on the risk and the hazard that is to the forefront to your workers. So again, an evacuation log to document your fire drills to see what is working. And these are great to document, especially if you're only doing it once a year, to track any patterns of what may be happening during that drill to even update your emergency response plans. Excellent. Question. I have one question here in the Q&A, and it's asking, and I guess you can probably see the incident report form and the incident reporting policy. So these two forms are great because if you did have an emergency and it was an incident, so maybe it was a vehicle and equipment collision on the road as you were transferring from the farm property to a field. So the policy outlines, and again, this is in a doc that you can download and bring up. And it gives you the conditions within occupational health and safety legislation for reporting to them, and then as well as the procedures of reporting as well. So how are you going to bring this forward? And then we highlight those of you who have workers' compensation to report to that body as well if it was an injury. Then, of course, we have a form to document the details of that particular incident. So I'm just going to open that up quickly here. And it's 2 pages, and it goes through all the criteria. So even if it was a fire, we could have fire, but we talked about it being a vehicle collision. And then the date, the specific location, the workers involved, what their particular position or occupation was on the farm. We collect age, gender, and experience just to see if this was an inexperience issue, complacency issue, maybe a lack of training problem, maybe it could be the underlying causes. We include whether there was first aid, medical aid, modified work, lost time, or fatality. And then, of course, object and equipment, witnesses, describing the scene, and pictures are phenomenal. These always fill in the gaps of what we don't get in the description. And those are very helpful to identify those underlying causes to figure out how we prevent it from happening again. And that's where we document the immediate cause. The immediate cause is always technically what happened. Tractor was making left turn and car was passing at the time of the left turn and collided with the tractor. So what were the underlying causes? So you would list what led up to that. Maybe did the farmer driving the tractor not signal? Was the car passing when it was illegal to pass? lot of different conditions that could possibly happen in that scenario. And then, of course, any trainings and instructions that were given to help prevent it prior. And then we document, of course, any of those conditions, if help was called, who came, who the first aiders were, whether we reported to WCB, cost of repairs, any insurance details, and here we list the recommendations for prevention. It's a great little tool. Tracking these and getting them documented. I know so many of you are so busy that you look at this paperwork and go, oh, just one more thing. But this can save you a lot of time and money in the long run, especially emergency response plans when you practice them, because you can potentially reduce a lot of losses in an emergency by having a good response plan in place. You can save lives by having the right number of first aiders available. First aid is not only just about helping, but it's also teaching those who attend preventative measures. So what to look for, signs and symptoms. So you can catch stuff early, you can head off a more serious injury or illness potentially happening on farm. So these documents are key in helping to identify these trends and incorporating measures way before it becomes very costly to both material resources and human resources. So if we kind of go back here, back to the commodity specific plan, click in emergency. There's only one thing that I want to draw your attention to, and just for time's sake here, I know we're getting close to the end of the half hour. I brought up the farmer safety rallies. I think I pushed it over here. Farmer safety rallies are little mini safety meeting templates, and I have them for emergency response as well. I have it for the first aid requirements, but let's take a look at fire extinguishers. Fire extinguisher safety month is usually September, so 1 month before emergency response month. But we want to make sure we have the correct number of fire extinguishers and the right class available. And then, of course, train our workers on how to use them so that if something does happen, they can pick that up and buy themselves time to get out or be able to put out that very, very small fire. So a farmer safety rally is a safety meeting template, and the first page is just all of your information that you're going to share with your workers in that particular meeting. And then the second page gives you a little bit of an agenda, so other things you can talk about and bring up in the meeting to have your workers participate and increase your two-way communication. Then there's also questions to highlight and any action items that you might want to record. Any near misses or unsafe acts and conditions that might have come up, you want to note those. Maybe some topics for the future. What else do the workers want to learn about? And then, of course, we have a little bit of a test your knowledge. Was everybody paying attention? Did they grasp the ideas behind the meeting? And then, of course, record your attendance. Now, you can do this particular template as a group, or you could print one double-sided for each person attending and have them have their own copy. And then once they print and sign, submit it as well as with their quiz answers. So very simple, easy to use resource to hold that meeting. Maybe you do it once a month, once a week. Should only take about 5 to 10 minutes, nothing longer. Your workers want micro sessions. They don't want a lot of information in very little time, but they do want some information in little time. So the highlights are important in these particular meetings and making sure they understand. And then we can use our inspections to follow up to specific unsafe acts or conditions that may exist. And so the farmer safety rally. Excellent. Now, this just brings us about 1 minute to the end of our 30. So is there any more questions that you have? I'm just going to double check the Q&A box as well as the chat. Just give me one moment. All right, we only have the one incident reporting question. If something does come up outside of this session, feel free to send me an email. You can send it to info@farmsafetyns.ca. And I'm just going to put that in the chat for you to copy and paste. So other than that, I've also mentioned in the chat, we have winter safety coming up in November. So as here in the province, we start typically getting winter weather about the same time we have our AGM. So our AGM is November 25th for the NSFA, and then the Farm Safety annual meeting is on the 26th, with also the continuation of the Federation meeting. So typically each year we have winter conditions. So we will be ahead of that meeting, meeting on the third Wednesday at 11:30, and then the fourth Wednesday at 7 p.m. So if you're not available during that lunch hour, feel free to join me in the evening. And then in December, we're going to look more closely at animal handling. So we'll give you some hints and tips on that. So without any further questions, I thank you for joining me at Farmer Safety Corner for the Emergency Response Edition.